Welcome to the Common Hour. My name is Ann Statura, and I'm the coordinator for community-based learning and community outreach in the Spanish department and chair of the Common Hour committee this fall. I'd like to introduce our ASL interpreter, Emily Phipps. Thank you, Emily, for interpreting for us at Common Hour. A very warm welcome to all at our second Common Hour of the semester. Common Hour is a unique and inclusive program that brings the Franklin and Marshall community together weekly during the academic year for culturally and intellectually enriching events. It is the only regularly scheduled event that unites students, faculty, and staff, and invites the larger community to join us. Throughout the pandemic, the Common Hour has continued to provide a virtual gathering space and a source of inspiration, education, and compelling discussion for the F&M community and beyond. We hope you will join us during Common Hour next week for our virtual event, We Can Ban Nuclear Weapons Worldwide, with Alicia Saunders-Zachra, 2019 Nobel Peace Prize winner and Policy and Research Coordinator of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Please follow Common Hour on our webpage and consider submitting a proposal for the December 1st Now Hour. Proposals are being accepted now through November 1st. During today's event, Zoom viewers can submit questions for our speaker via the Q&A feature. Please indicate your affiliation with the college, but we do not need your name. And now I would like to introduce Jim Strick, Associate Professor in the Department of Earth and Environment and Chair of the Program in Science, Technology, and Society, who will present today's speaker.
Thanks so much, Ann. Our speaker today, Professor Andrew Curran, is the William Armstrong Professor of Humanities at Wesleyan University. Many of you may remember him as our outstanding Darwin Day speaker in February of 2020, where he talked about the relevance of the work of philosophe Denis Diderot in the modern world. His talk today will describe the origins of modern scientific racism in 18th century France, based on his most recent book with Henry Louis Gates Jr. of Harvard. We're really looking forward to it. I would like to thank very much the Miller Humanities Fund, the F&M DEI Office, the Africana Studies Program, and Brooks College House for their generous support of this event. Coming off of the Ken Burns film about the US and the Holocaust over the last few nights, and with the surging of white supremacy among millions in the US, I can't really think of a more urgent time for a careful scholarly dissection of the roots of scientific racism, lest we watch while even more such history itself. Welcome, Andrew Curran.
Thank you so much. Am I being received okay? It's a real wonderful thing to come back to Franklin and Marshall. Alas, I'm sorry I can't come to Pennsylvania. I'm in France right now on sabbatical, but I had such a wonderful time last time, and I'm very appreciative of being back and speaking to you all. I want to thank the Common Hour Committee and all the various constituencies that came together to make this possible. James asked Henry Louis Gates and myself, whom I will refer to as Skip as I keep talking here, to speak to you about a very strange 18th century essay contest that we recently wrote about. And he's really sorry he couldn't be here. A little bit of history about this. I found out about this contest about 14 years ago when I was writing a different book. About this contest, which was organized by the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences. And the contest was on the causes of Black skin and textured hair among African populations. Now, believe it or not, this is one of the biggest anthropological questions of the day, linked as it was to the larger puzzle of how all of humankind's varieties, and you'll notice I'm not using the word race at this point, all of humankind's varieties came into being and how they related to each other or not. Now, before I get into this, I have a couple of caveats. First, I want to remind everybody I'll be talking about what I call textualized Africans. These are fabricated objects of study, objects of scientific discourse associated with the era's natural history. Now, I bring this up because speaking about the European representation of Africans in the history of race in general has a real trap, and that's giving credence to the false idea that Africans were simply objects. They played no active role in controlling their destiny or contributing to what became the Atlantic world. This is simply not true. I have a second caveat too, and maybe it's more of a reminder that during the era I'll be speaking about today, this is the mid-18th century generally, biology, anthropology, ethnography, ethnology simply don't exist. All of these things, or all of these kind of preoccupations, or the preoccupations that lead to these disciplines, were subsumed under the larger rubric of natural history. And this is maybe something we can talk about later. Now, in order to understand what is at stake in these essays, the essays that were submitted to this contest, we need to talk a little bit about the city of Bordeaux and its academy. Now, let's start first with the academy itself. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. If you give me a second. Of course, I forgot my mouse, so I have to do this with my hand popping up in front of the screen. So I'm not in share and play from the start. All right, so there we go. That should be working there fine. There's the title of this talk, and here's the book that Skip and I did, and here's where I'm coming now. So here is the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences, and this is a 19th century photo, of course. And like many scientific academies, the Bordeaux Academy was founded in the 18th century in 1713. This is precisely 30 years before, since we're all in Pennsylvania at this point, before the American Philosophical Society was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin. These are learned societies. They're not universities. And I'd love to talk about that during Q&A if somebody wants to ask me about that. These are learned societies, almost like gentlemen's clubs in some ways. Now, as part of the charter of the Academy, the men, the fellows of the Academy, organized essay competitions at least once a year. And these were always on quote unquote physics-related subjects. The nature of air, the fluidity of bodies, where did kidney stones come from, maybe the source of earthquakes, if we're thinking about Mexico today. And among these contests, there was also a clear interest in the specificity of non-European and particularly African bodies and African anatomy. This is interesting. We think about the 18th century as being a time of anthropocentrism, the idea that the human race becomes very important, of universalism. As Alexander Pope said, the proper study of mankind is man. But there's also an anthropological thing happening here, where we start looking at differences among different populations, which often cuts against or kind of contradicts some of the larger kind of universal aspirations of what we call the Enlightenment era. Now, as I said, the fascination with African anatomy becomes explicit, obviously, in 1739 when the Academy announces their contest on Blackness in Europe's most prestigious and literary journal. Call for papers goes out all over Europe. And they promise the winner a gold medal worth 300 livres, which is about an annual, a worker's annual salary. It's a lot of money. So now let's talk a little bit about Bordeaux. Now, there surely are a number of reasons why, I'm going to stop the share here. There's surely a number of reasons why the Bordeaux Academy found the subject of Blackness so compelling. First of all, the city's very identity had become intricately linked to the wealth flowing from the slave-based economies of the French Caribbean. And here I'm talking about Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti. And by mid-century, in fact, the city boasted the busiest and most important port in France, much of it coming from trade with the Caribbean. Bordeaux's wholesale merchants dispatched, of course, wine, for which they were known, lard, flour, beef, rolls of cotton, paving stones, copper utensils, pottery, roofing materials, wood, hardware, tools, fabrics, you get the idea. And in exchange, they also supplied weapons to control the African populations. In return, they received raw and refined sugar, an enormous assortment of different kinds of colonial merchandise, which they then refined often and sent off to different parts of Europe. They were making a killing. Most of Bordeaux's investments ultimately centered on Saint-Domingue, and I'm going to show a couple of more slides here. Share screen and play. This is actually from Josephine de Beauharnais' plantation in Martinique. I took it in, this is Napoleon's wife, her plantation in Martinique. Anyway, so I was saying that, Bordeaux had a huge kind of relationship with the Caribbean, and most of their investments centered on Saint-Domingue, Haiti. And by the end of the century, Bordeaux essentially had a monopoly on what was going on in Haiti. The majority of the 792 sugar plantations belong to Bordelais folks, 3,000 indigo plantations, 2,800 coffee plantations, 705 cotton plantations. These were all owned by, the majority of them were owned by people from Bordeaux. Now I want to show you a little bit about Bordeaux itself. The colony derived affluence from this era can still be seen in Bordeaux's stunning cityscape. And I'm not sure if any of you have been to Bordeaux. It's an absolutely beautiful city. There were 5,000 stone townhouses and apartment buildings and individual houses built during what was called the Golden Age. And the most telltale vestiges, and here's another shot of Bordeaux's beautiful cityscape, the most telltale vestiges of their colonial involvement can be seen floating above the doors of several old custom houses near the banks of the Garonne River. And there's actually, the custom houses are right here that you're looking at across this giant fountain. These are called mascarons, sculpted stone faces with African features that stare out at passerbys below. These bas-reliefs are a telling reminder that Bordeaux's slave traders were also responsible for transporting 150,000 Africans to New World plantations between 1672 and 1837. 150,000 Africans is more by 50,000 than the population of Bordeaux in the 1780s. This represents 12% of the 1.2 million enslaved African captives who arrived alive in the French colonies. So anyway, Bordeaux's deep involvement in the colonial trade had given rise to another concrete reason why Bordeaux, the Bordeaux Academy would have found the subject of Blackness to be a compelling topic. The city had become home to an increasing number of Africans, Caribbean-born so-called Creole Blacks, or mixed-race people of color. In fact, some 4,000 Africans or Afro-descendants passed through or lived in Bordeaux during the 18th century. Very often they were sailors, pages, cooks, caterers, wig stylists. Some were doing apprenticeships before returning to the Caribbean, or some actually escaped. Now, to understand why the Academy itself may have taken up the question of Blackness in 1739, we need to take a look at who these people were. Now, during the 18th century, most people referred to the Academy Royal, or the Royal Academy of Sciences, Belles Lettres and Arts of Bordeaux by its abbreviated title, the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. Yet the majority of the Academy's members were not what we might consider scientists. While there were a dozen or more people who were trained as doctors, engineers, and botanists, hydrographers, and mathematicians, all of these kind of qualified people had the titles of associates. And the dominant group in the Academy, from which the president was always elected, was made up of membres ordinaires, ordinary members, or regular members. And these were the nobles, and in the vast majority of cases, magistrates and members of parliament. This is very significant. The Royal Academy of Science, as the saying went in the 18th century, was actually the daughter of Bordeaux's parliament. And the Bordeaux parliament ruled over the larger region around Bordeaux, the so-called Guyenne region, as a sort of a kind of supreme court. It's interesting to see that as these Black populations in Bordeaux became much more visible, Louis XV and all over France too, and Nantes and some of the other kind of slave trading cities, Louis XV, King Louis XV, felt declared to issue a declaration, clarifying their status in 1738. And to avoid problems, and he was surely really alluding to miscegenation and the spirit of independence that might develop over time, he limited Africans' stays to 3 years. And the ostensible goal of this edict, theoretically, was to control or even limit slavery in France. What it really did was propose the further codification of the presence of human bondage in the country. And provincial parliaments, as was always the case, were called on to ratify this declaration, including Bordeaux's parliament, including those 18 members who were simultaneously in the academy. And of course, they all voted unanimously in favor of ratifying the king's proposal, effectively endorsing the existence of slavery on French soil only months before the contest of blackness was proposed in 1738. Now, as I said, by the 1730s, Bordeaux had entered into an era of tremendous prosperity thanks to its links to the colonies. And unsurprisingly, the Academy's members tended to be champions of the city's manufacturing and maritime businesses. Indeed, in the archives, I did find something quite interesting from 1726. This is about a decade after the institution instituted their prize puzzles or their contests. Now, during a meeting in 1726, the members voted that in those years when the Academy did not award a prize, they would reallocate the money and purchase shares in the Compagnie des Indes, the French Company of the Indies, and this included the West and East Indies. In other words, the Royal Academy of Sciences of Bordeaux was investing in the slave trade in a company that had recently been awarded the monopoly of slave trading in the French islands and had already been responsible for transporting 120,000 Africans to the Caribbean before the contest was announced in 1739. So you can see there's a real link between science at this point and mercantilism, despite the fact, if you think about it, that the way the contest was described doesn't talk about slavery at all. It talks only about skin and hair. And this is actually why Skip, when I talked about titles for the book, and I came up with a kind of a boring title, I said, no, the title of the book is Who is Black and White? Because that's the question they're asking. They're not only talking about what is the cause of blackness, but they're talking about who is black and why, and what is the political significance of this question. And I hope we can get back to that a little bit later. So I'm going to talk about the essays themselves at this point. So I've been kind of beating around the bush, but let me get back to that now. Here's the mascaron. Here's one of the essays we're dealing with. And I should say that the translation process was something that was incredibly difficult. Very often the script was on relatively thin paper. And so you could see the writing on the other side. And so it was almost like cross-hatching all the way across. Some of them were really very tough to kind of decipher. I felt for the Bordeaux Academy members who had to deal with this as well. So anyway, let's talk about these essays a little bit and what they can tell us about the history of the concept of race. And I hope we can, again, go back to some of the specifics about this later on. I think it's really interesting in that the way that race is generally taught and written about is a kind of a horizontal history, sometimes a kind of a theoretical history following theoretical paradigms, sometimes a history that follows an idea, history of ideas, intellectual history. But this is great because it's really the first kind of core sample or focus group of what a lot of different people from different parts of Europe were thinking all at the same time in the 1740s. So coming to grips with what is inside this contest is it necessitates taking a step back to the past. And you have to embrace the kind of strangeness and the exoticism of the past to understand what's going on. You have to remember that these essayists did not have the benefit of the scientific knowledge available to us today. They lacked the science of genetics. They lacked forensic anthropology. And obviously, these white-centered Europeans would have scoffed at the idea that human species can trace their origins to an original group of African hominids that spread out over the globe about 100,000 years ago. Now, this is the first problem for these folks, and that is the problem of timescales involved in the out-of-Africa narrative of the human species. This would have been absolutely unimaginable at the time, and even harder to grasp would have been the idea that the world's northern, quote unquote, white populations are themselves the descendants of dark-skinned Africans. This said, the writers who contributed to the Academy contest had their own explanations for the origin of Blackness. Indeed, one finds a staggering range of possibilities scattered throughout these 16 essays. For example, Adam or Eve was originally black, or Adam was half black. This is actually a heretical idea. Blackness is a mark of God denoting sinfulness. God made all people white, but some unknown exterior causes generated blackness. Blackness is a God-given gift, allowing people to live in the torrid zone. God transmits ethical proclivities to people who then advance these principles toward glory or toward degeneration. There might be a moral defect in parents, maybe a perverse disposition of the mind that led their progeny to be black. Blackness arises from vapors emanating from the skin. Africans have darkened semen, which is interesting in that this is an idea dating from antiquity, but also has serious implications for heredity as well. Of course, these are insane ideas. Blackness results from the blood. Blacks have darker blood because of the effect of air. There was somebody who said there was a specific liquid in the black body, and that this hereditary feature is passed down from the soul of the father, who, quote, impresses blackness on the mother. White skin has a great number of tubes filled with transparent liquid near the surface of the skin, whereas Africans have far thicker blood that cannot nourish the tubes, and thus they have drier, darker skin, getting into anatomy at this point. And finally, if certain geographical locations produce certain traits, for example, England's air produces red hair, then it follows that the African region can produce black skin. One of the more insightful, one of the few insightful comments coming from the contestants to submit an essay was when he lamented that whoever takes up the question of blackness enters into a problematic land of conjecture. And this is certainly the truth. Now, having kind of just provided a laundry list of some of the ideas that you see here, I want to break down the essays a little bit more. Now, as I said, there's 16 essays, 8 were written in Latin, 8 were in French, and a number of these anonymous essays were written by scripturally minded contributors, be they ecclesiastics or very devout lay people. And of course, since these were anonymous, in most cases, we don't know exactly who wrote them. These essays came from as far as Sweden, one came from Germany, one from Ireland, and most of them came from France. Now, for these contestants, the reasons for participating in this natural history competition, for the contestants who had this kind of religious orientation, the reasons for participating in this ostensibly natural history contest had little to do with determining the source of black skin and black hair. The real goal was putting forward a theory of difference that was compatible with scriptural authority. And this would be specifically, these problems would be related to 3 major truths, all of which related to the creation story. The first was that of biblical chronology, the question of biblical chronology, the belief based on a literal reading of the Bible that God had created the earth precisely 5,741 years before the 1741 contest. And here I'm showing a wonderful thing from the year 1741 Royal Almanac, which was sanctioned by the king, which describes the fact that there was 4,000 years between the creation and the birth of Christ, 485 years since the flood, and 1,741 years since the birth of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really circulating and seen as really something that most people should accept. Now, as important as this biblical timescale was the status of nature itself. For the most literalist of biblical scholars, nature had no autonomous history. It was static, it was fixed, it was providentialist. It was a category dependent entirely on God's will. In fact, the term natural history being used probably until 1730, 1740 was something of a misnomer because it didn't talk about the way nature changed over time and the different kind of creatures one would find in nature. It was really a description of a fixed nature. It was very much like Pliny's natural history as well. Now, in addition to these two problems related to the creation story, there's a third, and this is perhaps the most important. It's the idea that, according to Scripture, all the world's peoples were not only created by God, but were God's children. They were members of a larger family of mankind. And here I'm going to show you yet another slide here, the drunkenness of Noah from the Bolognese school, 17th century. Now this belief in shared blood remained one of the most powerful features of European thought during the 18th century, even among the more medically or anatomically oriented essayists. Several of the people who sent in submissions, in fact, referenced the famous Old Testament parable, which we see here, recounting how Noah's 3 sons split up and populated the earth after the ark had come to the rest in what we know now as the Caucasus. Hence the term Caucasian later on. Now, while some of the Bordeaux essayists dabbled in hundreds of pages, some of which I cut, of biblical exegesis, talking about the myth of Ham, and here we see the myth of Ham, where Noah's son Ham sees Noah naked after Noah has been drinking too much and is cursed. In fact, he is cursed, his son is cursed, Canaan, and the curse of Canaan is that Canaan's descendants will be the servants of servants. Later on, this is mixed up with blackness in the Old Testament. Of course, there's no mention of blackness. But a lot of the contributors to the contest talked about this and drew from other theologians to talk about this idea. But most of the people who were thinking about the idea of some kind of human sameness, they tended to emphasize, they alluded to this, they went into something else quite quickly, and they tended to emphasize the positive proto-biological notion embedded within this parable. And that is namely that the Bible stated unequivocally that humankind shared one origin, that all people had come from a so-called monogenesis. I've got one more slide here. There's a couple definitions here. Now, this monogenetic notion, the idea that there was one shared species, the same origins, brings us to the precise language that the Bordeaux Academy used in constructing its question for the Journal des Savants, this famous journal that they published in. And the question they actually said, they posed to all of Europe was, what is the source of the degeneration of black hair and black skin among African populations? I'm paraphrasing here. And the key is that human degeneration was starting to rise up as one of the most important paradigms for understanding human beings around us from the 1720s and 1730s on. It was really critically important. And today, we may have heard the term degenerate. The first time I heard it was in a cartoon, I think. The term degenerate conjures up someone who has lost the physical, mental, or moral qualities considered normal and desirable. And this same basic concept functions on the level of human species in the Academy question. In asking the contestants to identify the causes of African degeneration, the Bordeaux Academy was asserting that Black humans were somehow debased and corrupted, albeit members of the human species. Now, describing an entire group of humans as a degenerate branch of the human species is certainly appalling. And yet what's strange about this whole thing is that the Academy's reliance on the concept of degeneration was actually designed to create a firewall between their competition and an even more dreadful notion than degeneration, which was polygenesis. Should we go back to polygenesis? Better. And the notion of polygenesis is that the most extreme examples of humans, in fact, the kind of the general categories of humans, Africans and Laplanders in particular, were actually distinct species of humans who had come into being separately and independently from whites. Now, the belief that distinct human groups had distinct origins had been advanced by a small and marginal group of heterodox thinkers as early as the 16th century. Like other anthropological notions floating around at that time, polygenist theory was first discussed in the context of the era's religious debates, and in particularly the significance of the discovery of new types of humans that had not been accounted for in the Bible, particularly Amerindians. As early as 1520, the Swiss physician and alchemist Paracelsus had challenged the traditional Genesis story by claiming that there was not one, but two Adams, a white one who had come into existence in Asia and a Native American one who had been created in the New World after the flood. You can see he's trying to work out the inconsistencies within the Bible. Several decades later, the Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno followed his lead, but pointed to Africans as obviously stemming from either a Black Adam or a separate pre-Adamite race. And by 1655, a French theologian named Isaac de Terre, was P-E-Y-R-E-R-E, published the most influential book theorizing a polygenetic explanation of humankind in his book called The Pre-Adamites. He claimed that before God created the Jews, he had given life to tribes of Gentiles, Native Americans, Eskimos, Africans, South Sea Islanders, Chinese, Europeans, etc., all of whom initially lived in something akin to Hobbes' state of nature. And what's fascinating to see is that two of the Bordeaux essayists picked up on this idea. They mentioned either Black Adams or pre-Adamite races, but they knew that something was kind of contentious about that. And after they did so, they carefully avoid developing these highly unorthodox ideas. There was one essayist, however, who found the related theories of La Perre's free-thinking friend, François Bernier, very compelling. Now, François Bernier, in 1684, which is fully 60 years before the contest, he was so ahead of his time in many ways in terms of contributing to the idea of a taxonomic construction of race. In 1684, Bernier had argued in an article called The New Division of the Earth in the exact same journal where they published their call for papers. He argued that humankind could be organized into fixed, distinct categories, and this really was a watershed. Well, Bernier did not put forward a polygenist understanding of humanity per se. He certainly encouraged people to think of human beings as composed of fundamentally different races or species. And in fact, he used the term race and species to say we have 4 or 5 different races or species. And what's really interesting about this is that we could see a shift in terminology from the idea of human varieties, which is one term being used in the 18th century, to human races. And this is a shift from one kind of register or metaphor, which is that of botany. Variety is a botanical metaphor, to the idea of race, which is a zoological idea, which is the idea that humans can be understood as animals, analyzed as such, and maybe broken down into classification as such. Classification was not really used until 1735. We'll get back to that in a second for humans. Now, in the minds of some naturalists and philosophers, this possibility of a breakdown of the human races into categories blended with polygenesis. And this was true for Voltaire, who was, we have to remember, the most famous French philosopher of the 18th century. Voltaire claimed that the anatomy and the intelligence of Ethiopians, as he called them, differed so much from those of whites that it was clear that blacks were members of an entirely distinct species with distinct origins. He writes, "It seems to me that my belief that there are different kinds of men, just there are different kinds of trees, is well founded. Pear trees, fir trees, oak trees, and apricot trees do not at all come from the same kind of tree, and the bearded whites, the wool-bearing Africans, the horse-haired yellows, and the beardless men, meaning Native Americans, do not originally come from the same species of man." Now, the Academy had bylaws that prevented them from putting forward any views that would be contrary to religion. And they didn't want to encourage any such answers to the question of blackness. By forcing their essayists to explain how the degeneration of black skin and hair came about, they were predetermining the type of essay that would win the contest. And this was an essay that implicitly respected a biblical understanding of humankind. But they would presumably explain how an original group was related to the degenerate African. Now, most of the essayists who attempted to explain black skin and hair understood perfectly what the Academy wanted. Though the truly religious contestants restricted themselves to arcane interpretations of the Bible, most essayists moved past the Bible to more naturalist explanations that were not divine in origin. And these included examples of climate theory, humoral theory, and anatomical discoveries. And the third essayist in the collection is typical in this respect. His essay begins in a very providentialist fashion by asserting that all colors of the human species are God-given, but then he transitions toward a hybridic explanation of blackness that combined several naturalistic possibilities. According to this theory, the first Ethiopians were red, not black, and polygamy and inbreeding in the heat of the torrid zone infected this human variety, causing them to turn and remain black. I see that time is moving quickly here, so let me move on here a little bit more. What happens is that some other people are thinking about the potential mutability of the species, and this is something that's really interesting. And one of the essayists, who was not a providentialist, said, "I'm a living example of the fact that people can change in different climates," thinking about climate theory. He said his ancestor was black and that his ancestor was taken to Germany and changed. And he said his pigmentation showed no traces of this coloring now. And he claimed that Ethiopians, when they moved to colder climates, could become white. And the same way that whites moved to hotter climates could turn black. And this is really very interesting. Epistemologically speaking, in contrast to fixists and biblical scholars and providentialists, there are a number of thinkers, and we see it in this contest, who are asserting that natural forces on matter could produce accidents, including human accidents that are outside of God's jurisdiction. This is one of the things that lets the race genie out of the bottle later on. Now, the belief in human mutability appears very briefly in several of the Bordeaux essays and gains traction over the years. In 1749, the keeper of the king's garden, Georges Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, the Count of Buffon, said that as soon as mankind moves around the world and spreads from climate to climate, he will change. And the changes are such that the markings are in no way original or distinct. They're natural alterations, and these differences are only on the outside. They're superficial. And it is in fact certain that all humans are nothing more than the same man who has been adorned with black in the torrid zone and who has become tanned and shriveled by the glacial cold at the Earth's pole. Now, it's interesting to see that in this whole idea of degeneration that's cropping up at this time, we're seeing two different things. The first one is that Buffon is forcefully asserting that the differences among the world's peoples are always skin deep. He rejects taxonomy, the idea of classification, the fact that there's strict separation among human varieties. He calls them varieties. On the other hand, his version of the human story implies, much like the contest, that the ancestral and qualitative supremacy of a white prototype race is clear, and having multiplied and spread across the surface of the earth, they produce all of humankind's varieties. This is a kind of an idea of primacy and originality. Now, the final essay in this contest, which I think is super important. So you have classification kind of tendencies. You've got anatomical, you've got climatological ideas. And you also have anatomy, which is rearing its ugly head in this contest. And the most important essay, actually, this contest, written by a guy by the name of Pierre Barrère. I'm actually working on him for a new book project. Now, Barrère, we know who he is because he's the only person to publish his work after the fact. And Barrère had actually studied Black anatomy in his capacity as surgeon in the plantation system in Guyana, in northern South America. And he went way beyond what other essayists were saying about the internal constitution of Africans. He said that the blood was Black, notice that, the bile was Black. And what's happening here is we see the notion of race is going from the outside, the exterior is something that's related only to pigmentation, to the inside, to a basic anatomical structure. And in 1755, after his essay from the contest is published, a whole bunch of other people are going to jump on an anatomical bandwagon, including the German anatomist Johann Friedrich Meckel, M-E-C-K-E-L, who announced that Africans had bluish brains and darkened pineal glands. These are all terrible things. Another 10 years later, Claude Nicolas the Cat in 1768 is going to say that he's discovered something different, an elemental Black fluid coursing through African's body called ethiops. Again, we see that the anatomists are finding things that do not exist in reality, obviously. Now, these things were kind of tossed away in the history of medicine, history of science, because they don't lead to anything real. They don't lead to any real progress. Yet what's really fascinating about this is they inspire a new generation of real classifiers, unlike Bernier, unlike Linnaeus in 1735. The German classifiers of Blumenbach and Kant will be using these basic anatomical ideas in order to justify their breakdown of human categories in a much more serious way. Race is really born when categories and classification becomes much more codified in the 1770s, because it allows for centuries of stereotypes and xenophobia to be organized in a way that is entirely different from the way it was being organized in this much more anecdotal world in the 17th and early 18th century, or even in this contest. What happens by 1770 is entirely different. So I've jumped about 5 pages here, and that's okay. I'm going to actually kind of end up with a little anecdote, which I think might lighten things up, because it's just such a kind of a tough thing to talk about. So what's interesting about this contest is that they didn't find a winner. As I said, they invested their money in the Compagnie des Indes instead of giving the money away to anybody. And so these manuscripts lay in the archive for a long time until we, Skip and I resurrected them and wrote about them and tried to kind of talk to them about this significant moment when science is really taking over and claiming the right to talk about human categories in a way that never had been done before, even if the essays themselves seem to be stuck in the past in some ways. No one really talked about this too much for, after 3 or 4 years. There are a couple of people who were prompted to write their own explanations, but didn't submit to the Academy. There's only one person who talked about this, and that, believe it or not, was Voltaire, again, the most famous philosopher in France at the time, and really kind of a world authority and public intellectual. And he wrote about it in the book Candide, the most famous book of the 18th century as well. And Candide, for those of you who might have forgotten, is this short story about a hapless character named Candide who goes around, he gets kicked out of his castle and goes around the world and has disaster after disaster. And it's designed to refute the idea of philosophical optimism in the 18th century, the idea that all is good in the best of all possible worlds. So to make fun of this idea, Voltaire kind of comes up with all these catastrophes. And one of the catastrophes is the African of Suriname he stumbles upon, who has had his leg cut off. And this is where we see Voltaire as being something of an abolitionist. We can talk about that later. But a second kind of anecdote happens when Candide is coming from South America to Bordeaux. And he's on a ship, and he has this one pet sheep with him, pet sheep with red hair. And he has this sheep who is the one surviving member of maybe 100 sheep, all of which were charged with, lots and lots of gold. He's lost all his gold. He's lost all his sheep except for one sheep. And he shows up in Bordeaux. And what does he do with this sheep? He said, well, I've got to go to Paris and I can't take the sheep with me in a carriage. So I'm going to donate this sheep to the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. So he goes to the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences and hands over this red sheep. And the narrator says, and what happens is the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences immediately saw this as an excellent opportunity to create one of their prize puzzles, one of their contests. And they announce all over Europe, what is the source of red sheep's wool? It's obviously referring to the Academy contest. Now, unlike and Voltaire's really making fun of this because he's saying there's no way that this contest can find out what the source of blackness is. So he's mocking the Academy. He's mocking all these contests, which incite lots of silly people to write silly answers. But he does say in this story, unlike in real life, that a famous naturalist from the north is submitted a contest entry which won, which said that because a squared plus b squared minus d squared proves that the sheep is red and will die of the mange. So that's the joke coming along with this whole thing. And I think it's important to understand that even though Voltaire was making fun of this, even though the contest itself didn't produce any actual kind of usable knowledge other than Barrere's book, the contest itself is it helps bring about a new era. And as I said, one in which science is really claiming the right to provide compelling anatomy-based explanations for humankind's many varieties. And these methods and discoveries have another function as well later on in the century, which was, of course, vindicating the ongoing dehumanization of enslaved Africans and people of African descent in the Americas with supposedly empirical data. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for your talk. As you can see, the Q&A is open and we have some questions already coming in, but you still have time to add your questions to the list. And so I would like to begin with a question from a faculty member. He or she writes, or they write, the Bordeaux Academy being invested in the slave trade can't help but make me wonder about scientific academies, colleges, and universities today, for example, being invested in the fossil fuel industry. Do you know anything about when and how the Bordeaux Academy ended its investment in the slave trade?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, which speaks once again to this question of mercantilism, capitalism, human bondage. There's things and the kind of the role of science. So one of the things I should kind of point out here is that the academy itself could invest. They weren't investing a lot of money here. I mean, this is really pretty restrained. The aristocratic members, as aristocrats, would not be involved with the real merchant class at all in France. It could be different in England, right? But in France, they really didn't get their hands dirty. They were landholders, the landed gentry, and their money came from that. This said, when some aristocrats kind of had tough financial times, they would marry a very rich, marry into a bourgeois family, and so there'd be kind of trickle up economics in some ways. Now, about when they got out of the business, I should say that what happens is that this is an academy seen as having tremendous privilege during the French Revolution. It's the French Revolution that puts it out of business. They shutter the Academy of Science, the Royal Academy of Sciences, in 1794 when they cut off the king's head. Which shortly thereafter, the academy is closed. Eventually, it will be come back into life in the 19th century as the Royal Academy, Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. The royal part has gone. So, I mean, Bordeaux lost its shirt after after the revolution, because the Haitian revolutionaries are kind of taking over the country, and by 1804, Bordeaux loses 15% of its population. So a lot of those people who were implicated here ended up bankrupt, probably. So, I mean, really, the population just drops precipitously. Bordeaux's in huge. It used to be just, the port used to be full. It was empty by 1805 or so.
Another question from a faculty member. Do you know whether later 19th century racial science scholars cited any of the Bordeaux essays, or at least the one that had been published, or if they were unknown, were the same different or were the different schools of thought, climate and anatomical, reinvented independently by later natural historians?
Wow, that's a really good question. It's really interesting to see that someone like Barrère, he writes this thing, and he actually submitted it to the contest 20 years after he had been in Guyana, way after the fact. So it sounds very empirical, but it's based on this, almost a nostalgic understanding of his relationship to these bodies that he, on which he did autopsies before. That idea, however, just takes off to the 18th century. It goes all the way. It's in Notes on Virginia by Thomas Jefferson. It moves through to Gobineau. It moves through to lots of different people. The idea of some kind of elemental difference becomes, definitely part of 19th century race science, particularly among people who are not actually involved in the empirical side of things. They just recycled the whole thing. I think it's really important to think of the, without doing too much periodization, by 1770 or so, when abolitionists start attacking the slave trade, what's really fascinating is that that's the first moment where the pro-slavery lobby is obliged to take some of this racist idea, these racist ideas, and really marshal them in a coherent fashion, including the anatomy, including the kind of cognitive issues, and so on and so forth. Before that, 1740s, 30s, et cetera, people didn't worry about justifying slavery as much, because they said that they were much more religious. And so they were saying that African captives were giving up their physical freedom, but they were getting eternal salvation, and that was a pretty good deal. So, by 1770s, as people become more secular, that doesn't work. And that's when the pro-slavery people are going to grab all this stuff. And that goes all the way through to the 1860s, 70s, and 20th century. It just keeps going. So race is like a virus. It just goes through and it changes shape. One of the things we have to think about this contest, which is so emblematic, is that there's, all these different ideas, all these kind of contradictory kind of theories going on. And you would think they would say, well, you know what, there's so much contradiction here, then there's no truth. And maybe there is nothing to begin with. But in fact, everyone is convinced that it is out there. Race is out there. We just need the right person to find it.
Thank you. A faculty member asks, did Ben Franklin weigh in on this issue of what is Blackness?
I don't think so. I don't think there are other Americans like Benjamin Rush who get involved with some of these ideas. The Americans are not taking center stage. There's a guy named John Mitchell from Virginia, who I think he heard about this contest a little too late. And he wrote up a big thing and then sent it to the Royal Society instead in London. And I think it ended up being published. And so there, we do see a lot of American interest in some of these ideas. And I think Jefferson's interest in this idea happens particularly because he's hanging out with more kind of natural. I mean, Ben Franklin, don't get me wrong, is in Paris, has seen a lot of different people. He's much more of an abolitionist. And so I think he's probably not, and I'm stretching here, there's probably some Ben Franklin experts here who are going to kind of kill me for this, but I just don't think he's as interested. And he was very much involved in a book called The History of the Two Indies, which was published by a guy named Raynal. And that is a big abolitionist book. And it had a lot of kind of refutation of some of the anatomical type stuff. Benjamin Franklin made Raynal an honorary member of the American Philosophical Society. So that's kind of where he stood. Jefferson, on the other hand, is fascinated by the implications of this. And also he's a plantation owner, right? So he's just been living in this world much more so. and probably much more susceptible to some of these ideas. Certainly, I know I'm looking at the works he's reading in France, particularly this guy named Cornelius de Paul, which really infected Voltaire's view of the world.
Did you find any evidence of people in Ethiopia or in Africa hearing about the contest and reacting to this idea, or they themselves asking the opposite question, like, why are white people?
Yeah, so again, that's an important question. When I started, I was very careful to say that we're talking about Europeans' fantasy about a particular group of people, and said, we have to think about the opposite direction. So I'm really appreciative of this question. Really, no one heard about this contest, particularly outside of Europe and the Americas, I don't think. Still in all, we have to rely generally on either oral culture or on European reporters, quote unquote, on what Africans are thinking about whites. But there are lots of things written in the 17th and 18th century about theories of whiteness held by Africans, but those ideas are being written down by Europeans, saying this is what they're saying in Benin, this is what they're saying in what's today Togo, this is what they're saying in Ivory Coast, this is what they're saying, in Congo with a K, this is what they're saying here. And some of these things are generally having to do with various kind of theological, metaphysical ideas of various gods doing different things, different people. Whites get X, blacks get Y. The idea that kind of different things are being handed out to people. Whites get technology, and sometimes the African ideas that I've read about were that Africans got kind of a much more meaningful life or something like that. It's really interesting to see there's a kind of a ethical kind of thing on one side and basic technology on the other, which is often the way we kind of, that's the way that was kind of coming forward. I mean, this stuff I don't know too much about. I'm just thinking from some of the, 15 years ago, I read a whole bunch of travel logs and I saw that as well.
Thank
Good
you.
question.
I am actually going to ask one of our panelists, Jim Strick, has a comment about Benjamin Franklin.
Ooh, okay.
I do know something about that question that was asked about Benjamin Franklin. Fortunately, because we had a Darwin Day speaker about 10 years ago who told us that Franklin wrote an essay in 1751, not one of his more widely known essays, but he was lamenting the increasing immigration of dark-skinned people into Philadelphia. Only interestingly, what he meant by dark-skinned people was the Germans, who he considered black. And he lamented that they were inferior to the Anglo-Saxon stock that was so much the sort of superior ethnic background of America. It's a really interesting essay in a lot of ways, not just because not that many people know this side of Ben Franklin, but it's also very sort of anti-Malthusian, way before Malthus. He thinks that explosive population growth by the white race is what's going to make this country the strongest country in the world within a very short time. So, yeah, Franklin, I don't know if he knew about the Bordeaux contest, but he certainly did have opinions on the subject.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I thought he was friends with Anthony Benezet, who is the great Philadelphia abolitionist, at least knew him. He's a really fascinating character, and somebody at Franklin and Marshall should write a biography of him. He's just so interesting. You need to be in the archives in Philadelphia to do that. Really, really interesting person. Really super, super important. He should be on, really part of all of our kind of consciousness as a really interesting person.
Well, I hope all of our
Thanks.
students heard that, and now they have an avenue for their research. Thank you so much for your presentation today. Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for being here, and we hope to see you next week.